Headphones on, let's do this.
Hey, do you know of a podcast I could listen to that has nerd and comic books and stuff? I really can't find one.
I say, you ever heard of the Nerd Dome podcast?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nerd Dome Podcast, episode 255. I'm your podcaster without fear, Luke, and today I am joined with a very talented special guest. You may remember him from a previous episode, but go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, everybody, I'm Phillip Sevy. I use he, they pronouns, and I am a comic book artist and writer and D&D player. So, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, you're going to get a whole lot of D&D this week.
Yes, we are.
So, and I always feel bad because it always seems like the last time that you came on, scheduling conflicts with the other co-hosts happened too.
That's all good. That's why you have like 17 hosts. So
right, yeah, that's exactly why. But yeah, so we're not gonna go too much on any comic stuff this week, other than X-Men 97 is still fantastic. But we're just gonna kind of jump right into it. This episode is going to be all about Dungeons and Dragons and just our experience with it, and maybe some advice out there for people that have questions on running their own games and stuff like that. So we'll just start out. When did you start playing D&D?
You know, it's funny. I played a game of, I want to say Hero Quest when I was like 11, which was D&D board game like adjacent. Really interesting. I played 1 or 2 games of AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, when I was like 15. But outside of that, I did not really learn how to play D&D or play it until the end of 2019, where me and one of my good friends were just like, let's just teach ourselves how to play it. So I bought a bunch of stuff. I watched a couple of YouTube videos and I just jumped right into the game through the means of DMing. And that's how I learned. That's how I learned how to play Dungeons and Dragons.
So you just dove right in.
Oh my gosh. It was, it was like reading textbooks in another language. I bought the starter kit, which runs Last Minds of Phandelver module. And I read the like rule book and the like basic adventure manual guide 3 times through, just highlighting and underlining everything. I watched as many YouTube videos as I could find, like how to DM and how Dungeons and Dragons is. And I listened to things like Critical Role just to try and figure out what the cadence of a game sounds like.
Right.
And then it was just like, had a bunch of friends over. 1 or 2 had played before, most hadn't. And it was just like, let's just figure this out. And we just kind of played through all of Lost Minds over the next couple months and figured it out as I went along.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's kind of, when I was a kid, for me, I did play it like once or twice, just, over at a friend's house in the basement, eating pizza rolls. Right. Yep. But then I honestly didn't really play it until I was deployed in the Navy and we got done with work and there's nothing to do. And we had a guy that said, hey, I used to DM some games. You guys just want to, he's like, I don't have any modules or anything. We can kind of just, just wing it. And so we did that, off and on, not really a full campaign or anything like that, just with the nature of being in the Navy. But kind of similar for me, it was probably about 2017. We were about 100 episodes into this podcast, and one of our listeners, Dungeon Master Mike, he started coming on, and we all became friends. And he's probably one of the best DMs that I've ever been around. Like, he just, like, the world building and like never knowing, what way an adventure was going to turn. Even stuff like when we played we played through Tomb of Horrors.
Okay.
And he was like, okay, so it's the same playthrough. He's like, but I'm going to add my own,
Sure.
flavor to it. And it was fantastic. We started out trying to be, just original. We're going to do what we're going to do. But then it went off the walls, obviously. We found us a lost Chris. Hello, sir.
Wouldn't miss it.
All the Dungeons and Dragons talk. It's classic Chris.
How's it going?
Hey.
Yeah.
Long time no see, Phil.
I know. How you been?
Good. How are you?
I am doing pretty good, all things considered.
Nice.
We were actually just talking about when we first started playing Dungeons and Dragons, or the first introduction to it, I guess.
Perfect.
But yeah, so yeah, that was mine. It was again, like 2017 ish is really when I started to get back into it and having regular games with a regular group of people, and that was awesome. What about you, Chris? What's your first interaction with Dungeons and Dragons?
So first two things is there used to be a game store in the Valley Fair Mall in West Valley that would sell the Marvel role-playing game.
Oh,
and so we were dying to play that. And so we got that, but played it like a board game. Didn't really do it correctly. But to actual D&D, there was a D&D group in my high school that was started by the electronics teacher. And the electronics teacher, he would invite people to come and play. And I bought that Marvel role-playing game, and I brought it with me because they were like, oh, you could bring whatever game. No, you couldn't. You had to play his D&D game. And then the other weirdest thing is, I mean, there was all these red flags about that game. The guy was like, you know what? I'll let you have one of your stats as a double aught if you play a different gender than your own gender, which at one point feels like kind of inclusive, but on the other hand was like, that's really weird. Why is that something you want to encourage in this game? And that guy got fired because he was also like the career teacher at school. And so he was playing 20 questions with the students, and he gave one of the Latin kids the job. Like you would get a job, and then people would ask you 20 questions to figure out what the job was. And he gave one of the Latin kids migrant worker.
Ooh.
And nothing in his mind where he was like, this is a problem, you know what I mean? So that was the first foray into D&D, was like this weird thing that I probably shouldn't have never picked it up again after that, but many years of fun times after that, despite the weird intro.
So Philip, you kind of talked about it a little bit. You began like seriously playing as the dungeon master, not as a player.
I did. Yeah, I did. And it was, to me, it was a real fun way to learn the game. I mean, by trade, I'm a storyteller, working in comics and film and other stuff. Like, I love to tell stories. So hopping into it right away, I was like, oh, Dungeon Master is a perfect role for me. I get to tell a story with all my friends. And it took me a little bit to learn. And thankfully I did learn, because I have played with people occasionally where like they still haven't figured this out. DMing is not telling a story to your friends. DMing is creating a story with your friends. Right. And I think my first campaign, I ran Lost Mines, but I also homebrewed a huge amount of it at the same time to give like bigger stories and more stakes and bigger consequences. And Lost Mines is fantastic. I highly recommend it for new players. But I homebrewed all this other stuff, and I remember I came up with these really cool ideas, and we got to the end, and I had like a climax of a moment that I had spent months figuring out. And it, as a story note, it was really, really cool. As a D&D thing, it actually undercut all the things about D&D that make it great. And it really fell flat. And I was like, why did that fall so flat? And it took me a little bit of time, but yeah. DMing is like, all right, I'm going to set up a scenario, and then my players will respond to this setup, and then I will respond to their response. And it's just passing this story back and forth. And it's your job to essentially kind of like mold it and make sure, but the story you're telling has to be about your player characters, not about whatever cool idea you have. If your cool idea doesn't involve their characters, that's not the game. This is not the game for you. Go write a book. This
Right.
go write your Lord of the Rings epic or a comic or
Mhm.
something that doesn't involve other people, that is solely yours. That is an aspect that can be difficult to learn in DMing. But if you don't get it that right, your games are really disconnected. If your game exists regardless of who your player characters are, you're doing it wrong, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, that totally makes sense. Chris, did you start out as a player or a DM when you first got into it?
Player, I'm a horrible GM. You never, never, ever, ever want me running a game. I can't. It's so hard to remember character names. I will make up stuff and forget about it. We were playing a superhero game one time, and one of my friends had a power where they could detect other people's superpowers, and they sat in a room with another character, like the secret identity of the bad guy, for like 3 sessions, and I forgot to mention that he could detect the powers. So I'm actually terrible at that. But Phil, I was going to ask you, like in your like in all of your GMing stuff, like what's your secret weapon? Like what do you always like? One thing that I did actually do okay as a GM is props. I like making cool maps or something that was all like burned on the edges and stuff like that, cool things like that, and soundtrack, bringing music. I always, so I was okay as a support person like that, but as a GM, like what's your secret weapon or your special sauce in your game?
Yeah, I've tried a lot of that stuff and I love it. I'm just not great at it consistently. Like if I had time / if this was my job, I could do some dope stuff. But like I run out of time. I think my secret weapon, honestly, is crafting like stories that involve my characters. And it's like I was mentioning, it took a while and it's a honed skill, and I'm constantly going back. Like I use like mind mapping software when I design each of my sessions. And then I have individual files for like overall game stuff and main stories, and all of it's like, here are all my characters. Here are like things about their backstory or things about what they want to accomplish. And then here's all my like plot points and how do these connect. And sometimes it's months or years while I'll be staring at a character and a plot point. And I'm like, I need to connect these two, or else this plot point's just like a waste of everyone's time. And once I'm finally able to connect those two, it is like the best moment. It feels fantastic. I had one. I'm running a Curse of Strahd game right now, and we're getting close to the end. We've been playing for about 2 years, and I have a character and his backstory, which he gave me, which is really important to both him as a character and then him as a player. It comes back to stuff that he was playing 30 years ago in the 80s in like second edition, and other stuff. And he came up with this specific thing, and it did not fit in the Strahd game at all. But I'm like, I'm going to figure out how to make this work. So we would tease it. We would throw things out occasionally. And finally, just a couple weeks ago, I was like, oh my gosh, I figured it out. It's the most obvious answer in the world. But at the same time, like it linked this existing thing. So I think that's kind of like my secret weapon. I can't say I'm like amazing at it, but that's what I love to do, because you play out those moments. And I've had players be like, oh my God, have you been planning that for like years? That was the cruelest thing ever. And I was like, I figured that out 10 minutes before the game. But
yes, but also yes.
Yeah. I kept those open the whole time because I wanted to make sure that moment, a moment hit like this. So
Yeah. See, I from a couple of games that I've done, I'm more on the prop side as well.
So cool.
Last game I made a couple maps. I did the pour the rice on the parchment paper and outline it, and then do the little burnt edges. I did the little health potions in the little bottles with the D4s in it.
They're so cool.
Yeah, so I do that, and the game that we're currently playing, the DM in that, this is his first go round at it, and he's doing a great job. But I opened up my trunk of props. I'm like, here, if you want them, they're right here. So it's been pretty cool. I also did like the spell scrolls on parchment paper too.
Oh, that's awesome.
Was really cool. Tie them, do a little a wax seal on it. But yeah, no, that definitely does add, like, just holding something physically in your hand. You're like, this is the key, or something like that. So how did your first session as a DM go?
I think the first session went pretty well. Now I'm thinking back, 3.5 4 years ago. No, 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago at this point. Yeah, I think we had, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4 players and me to start, and then we brought another one in pretty quickly. And it was real fun. Like, so if you've never played Lost Mines of Phandelver, you all start out as level 1 characters. You start out on the Sword Coast, on like the Tribor Trail. You come across some goblins. And, you know, you're thinking goblins, right? There's 2 goblins, and they almost killed the whole damn party. And Lost Mines literally can be a TPK for a session. I've heard a lot of people talk about this. Just because, like, 2 goblins with bows and arrows can take out everyone. We had one person drop and another person almost die. But I think the upside of that is, like, you start off, like, everyone's like, oh, it's whatever. And then within a second, people are on the verge of death. I had players who were like, oh, shit. Like, we're all going to die right now. So it was a real fun introduction in that way. And what I really enjoyed about it is, you know, after they find the goblins, they chase them down a trail. They end up in a cave. There's essentially, like, a standard route to get all the way to the end of the cave. There's, like, a hidden chimney that, like, through a rock that someone can find, and it puts them in the bad guy's lair behind them. But it's, like, requires a bunch of checks, and I didn't think my players were going to do this. But my players were all very, like, we've got to look for everything. Let's check for traps. Let's do... So they're rolling high enough that they find this place. They climb up the chimney. They drop, like, behind the bad guy. They instantly charm the wolves that are supposed to attack them. And they gang up and kill the bad guy, and then they worked their way backwards throughout the whole thing. So it was real fun. It had good stakes, and as a DM, it taught me, like, I need to be quick on my feet because I don't know what they're going to do and how that's going to change the outcome of things. And they befriended a wolf that they kept as a companion the rest of that game. So
yeah, that's one thing I found from talking to a lot of people that play D&D is if there is an animal or some kind of cute thing, it will now needs to be protected for all eternity, and it will be there constantly, and you will have at least 2 players that are more worried about the safety of said animal than the actual story.
I want to address that and pause because something that's real fun that we did later on. I started listening to some GMs talking about the importance of having consequences with actions and giving people 2 impossible choices, ways to up the drama. Towards the end of the campaign, one of the characters was trying to save his nephew this whole time. And we come across the nephew, and essentially the nephew gets killed. There's something that happened to where he had to make a choice between saving his nephew and saving the wolf companion that they've had the whole game. And they, of course, saved the kid. It was a big goal, but all the players and characters were heartbroken that they had to sacrifice the wolf. So having, like, actual consequences and stakes of action, and finding, like, what does everyone love and how can I threaten that and how can I maybe take that away? It's cruel, but at the same time, it's like a big emotional moment that they still talk about years later. So
Right. Yep. I've had that done in games with, like, you know, family members and stuff like that. It's like, well, how bad do you really want to complete this quest? But yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask you, when, say you are in a TPK situation and you look down at your stats for your goblins and you are now worried that they're not going to make it through, do you maybe fudge a couple numbers in there, drop a couple HP?
You know, it really depends where we're at in the game, right? If it's the first session, I might fudge just because people have spent time building their characters and they're excited to go, and I don't want anyone to lose stuff right away. I've found later on in the game, it's actually better to have those tough consequences. And I'm bad at that. I've had a couple of times where, like, it's the same thing where, like, a player goes rogue and ends up picking a fight with someone they shouldn't pick a fight with, and this person just mops the floor with them, and I'm looking down at the stats of this monster, and I'm looking at this person, and I'm like, this monster would and should kill this person right now. Just by virtue of everything that's happening. And there's times where I'm like, I just have, like, the bad guy, like, I don't know, give him a scar or something and walk away. And I always regret those moments. And it's happened to me once or twice. And some of the times I've made the choice of, like, okay, this character has not had a story spotlight or a beat in months. And we are literally working into the story that is like big part of their character and their background and all they've been focused
Right.
on. And they just rolled some shit rolls. And I
Mhm.
could kill them right now, but I feel like that would just really be like defeating for someone who's invested so much emotional energy in like this aspect of their character. So there's been those times where I'm like, I'm going to fudge a roll. I'm going to fudge some stats because
Right.
I want them to have that moment we've spent months waiting for. But there's other times where I was like, that character was stupid. I should have killed them just as a consequence of their actions. So it's case by case basis. My advice to people is to lean on being a little bit meaner than they think they will. Because again, those are stakes. I sometimes a little too soft, and I'm like, I always regret those moments where I should have been harder, and it would have been a really like a stronger moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing as the games that I was running a couple times, I was like, ooh. I really want them to get through this. So maybe he has, 8 less HP or something like that, just little stuff. So I had another question. When it's about NPCs.
Sure.
So is that something when you're building an NPC, or is that again something that you put a lot of thought into, like beforehand, like, oh, they're going to meet Steve Graybeard and he's going to be everyone's favorite, or is it kind of more, this is the tavern owner, and then the party's like, well, what's his name? Where's he from? And you got to kind of come up with it on the spot. So it's basically preparation versus kind of ad-libbing.
Sure.
With
yeah.
NPCs.
I think the most important aspect to NPCs is give them one unique feature. And you can honestly create a list of unique features. I have a list of NPC names that I always have up. So when someone's like, hey, what's that guy's name? I can be like, well, that's Narnoth the Beloved. I have it written down so I don't pause and be like, oh, it's Jim. And not that Jim can't be really funny, but you only get one Jim every now and then. The rest of the time, you got to pretend like you know what you're doing. And that's all DMing is pretending like you know what you're doing. So yeah, I have a list of like NPC names off to the side that I always have up. Sometimes I also have a list of races and classes in case I need to pull up an NPC and be like, it is a Githyanki monk or something like that. I can quickly mix and match what are those. So I have kind of those things. And then for one unique thing or one quirk. Is it the name? Is it the way they move? It is a particular physical feature. I like to give everyone a specific voice, more or less, if they're someone that they're going to interact with. So if I'm planning an NPC, if I know okay, here is this NPC that they're going to interact with. And so I'm going to have him floating to wherever they go. So if they go to a tavern, this guy will be at the tavern. If they go to the waterfall, he'll meet them on the trail. So yeah, I'll put their name, their race, one or two lines that describe kind of their mannerisms or what they want. It's super important if your NPC has some sort of information to deliver that they have a goal in mind. And then I'll usually note an actor or something like that. So I can see okay, that actor, Sean Bean, I'm going to talk like Sean Bean the best I can. Cause I find vocal quirks or a sharp personality, not mean, but oh, they're silly, they do something like this, or oh, they're grumpy, or those always create really memorable NPCs. Sometimes again to the detriment of throwing a pet in there where they're like, this is our new best friend and we're taking them with us. I have in one game right now, they have 5 NPCs in the party with them right now, and I'm constantly trying to figure out how to get rid of them because it's too many people to run, but they make friends with everyone and everyone is their best friend. And
he's got a tummy ache and he needs to go home now.
So the one big game I'm running right now, and I've been running it for almost 4 years now. The first 2 years of the game were set inside a really big city. I wanted a social game. I wanted a fixed setting. So I created this rough sketch of a city. I figured out about 15 different businesses. I designed an NPC for each business, and I had little notes, and each one was unique. And to the point where they would just go from business to business some days, just checking in on all their friends. And it was really difficult, but it was really, really fun. And now that we've left that city, because after a while it was okay, we need to get out and do more things, and or all of the quests and stories started there have grown outward into the world. But now they'll still be like, oh, they'll still talk about the times they had with those people, or I wonder what this person's doing, or let's send him a letter, or things like that. And it was like town gossip was a kind of one that I had, and someone running a brothel, and like like a very fancy person running like a clothing shop, and each one had their own mannerisms and way they talked and walked, and it was real fun to design, and they would kind of build and grow as my characters interacted with them.
Okay. So again, I guess it could be an NPC, but this is for you as well, Chris. What is the favorite character that you have, either a character that you have played or a character that you have created over the time that you've been playing?
Yeah, I want to hear Phil's.
No, Chris, go first because I've been talking a lot.
So more recent game, Andrew was running one during the pandemic that we played a few sessions in, and I was playing a gnome necromancer that came from a town of gnomes that had like a candy-based economy system, where like everything in their town was like happy and joy and stuff like that. And but he had a knack for like bringing things back to life, and it was like the most horrifying thing for his village. Like you cannot we sell gumdrops here. You can't bring people's like pets back to life and stuff. And that's how he was trying to help. He was like, a kid's pet died, and he'd be like, look, Rover's back. And they're like, oh God, get away. And so that one was going to be fun. We only played a few sessions, and it was going to be a hard thing to try to hide that he was a necromancer. He was going to try to convince people he's an illusionist. So he'd like paint the bones and stuff. You know what I mean? It was a lot of stuff in there, but I also know that playing goofy characters like that gets old real quick. Like when you're fonking Hottie Peaks and you're, that gets old, but it's so hard not to pay. Because it's like Phil was saying, like when you're making up NPCs, they have a quirk so that you can remember who they are. If you meet a ship captain in any of my games, it's going to be Captain Ron. It's going to be Kurt Russell from Captain Ron. Because it's such an easy character to jump into and play, and he loves the sea, and there's all this stuff already set for him, right? And it's got a voice and everything, so that's going to happen. But I end up doing that with characters sometimes. And it ends up getting old.
That's awesome. For me, it would be the character that I probably played the longest. He was just a human barbarian, but he was like if you took Kratos from God of War and Tormund from Game of Thrones and you put them into one person. So he's a big, scary looking guy who loved to, just like adventure with his halfling friend. And he had like goats that he would have people come outside. And if they pet the goats, and they could pay, a copper to pet the giant screaming goats. Man, and
that pregnant pause you left before what he did with the goats, man, like easy.
Yeah.
I was like, what did he do to the goats?
We're trying to keep it PG.
Okay.
But no, he was really fun, and it was kind of the way that when Ryan and I started it, because it was just he and I and then the DM, we were like, let's do like fantasy version of Power Man and Iron Fist.
Cool.
So like he was the little guy monk and I was the big strong guy, and we even did fastball special all the time. I used to throw him at dragons. But I think I liked the character so much because of the relationships that he had with the other ones. We had a half elf ranger that was just constantly getting high on moon dust. Like that was his thing. So him and the big drunk barbarian would just all these well-laid plans. I'd be like, well, that's a good plan. And I would agree with that. But Valdis, on the other hand, he's not going to wait for you. I'm sorry. He's going to kick the door down. So that was always fun because it just added, we had so many different personalities in that. And he kind of, it's also a lot like, maybe not so goofy as Grog from Vox Machina. Little more serious than that, but not by much. but not by much. But yeah.
I think we have one player who is a druid, and I really really love playing with this player because I believe I was the one who taught him how to play D&D. He's now running his own game. I love nothing more than having players who go run their own games. I feel like a D&D grandpa. But he comes in and he just has the most like interesting approaches and ideas. That's why I love playing with new characters, is because they think in a way that is not like the standard D&D way to think. So he wanted a staff of awakening, and I foolishly gave him one when he went on a shopping trip. And the first thing he did was awaken a tree. So the tree became sentient, and now I'm running the tree, and the tree's name is Paul. And he talks, it's kind of like my version of Taika Waititi's character from Thor Ragnarok. The big rock guy. What's the big rock guy's name? Korg, there we go. You said Grog, and now I'm like, what? Yeah, Korg. So he's a similar cadence and mannerism to that, but he's brand new. This is the first time he's had sentient consciousness, so he is very innocent and doesn't understand the difference between life and death. And he wants to be a chef. He spent a long time. Basically, they just left him at in the kitchen of the manor they were at, and have the attendant and chef teach him how to cook. And now he's been going to druid school, so he's slowly taking levels in druid. So he's a sentient tree who is now a druid. My player gave him the staff of awakening, so he can awaken things if he wants to. And because he was a tree that was in one of the players' like homes growing up, like the brother had carved like a penis on this tree and initials. So now he always says like, "Do you want to see my penis?" And he like pull over where the carving is on the side of his wood. He's just, and it's one of those things like, right, like I'm not like an improv comic, and that's one of the tricky things about being a DM is the amounts of improvisation you have to do and hope it lands. But there's just a couple things about the way this character, this NPC thinks and does stuff that I'm always looking for opportunities. Like, how would Paul respond to that? And it's to the point where like my players will like talk to Paul forever. And it's so much fun because just of the way he is and the way they respond, it gets really easy to start riffing on some of the silliest, stupidest things ever, but also feels really like genuine to who this character is. And so that's one of my favorite ones. He's one of the funnest ones to play. And we have some really great moments every now and then with Tall Paul. So
the game that I was, the Star Wars game I was running, we had he was a bartender, but he was, I can't remember what the race is, but it's basically like an Aarakocra. It's a bird person. Okay. And I named him Harvey. So he was Harvey Birdman. and he was kind of like he was really nice, but it was like everything he had was kind of like knockoff that he made from behind the counter. And he's like, oh no, I'm trying to think, like just like someone that's got a shack that's like trying to sell the pearls, or like these are the greatest oranges you've ever had. And all the characters, at first it just started with one of the characters was just trying to get information from him, but then like you were saying, just riffing off who I was talking to. And then I was like, well, hold on, now I want to talk to Harvey. Now I want to talk to Harvey. And then we spent the entire session of them just talking to Harvey Birdman. And it was great. So the next question I had is, what is your worst D&D memory?
Oh, okay. So I think this is one of the ones where I learned the most, and I alluded to it earlier. So with setting up that first game, Lost Mines of Phandelver, essentially you start on the Tribord Trail. And so I set it up with my players, and there's pre-generated characters in that thing. So I gave them all the sheet. I was like, who do you want to play? And they kind of slowly fleshed out characters from those, but it was fairly pre-established. But I told them all, you don't remember the last couple weeks you just come to on the trail with all these people. So it was a way to get into the game and have everyone kind of starting at ground zero. But in the back of my head, I was like, all right, at some point I'm going to answer the question of why do they not know anything? And there were some things I changed along in the game as far as the big bads and things like that. But at one point in the final big dungeon, you encounter a doppelganger, which is like a shape-shifting monster. And it's just really there to there's not really a lot of story necessity for this doppelganger. And I was just like, well, because again, you know, as a DM, you read the module 2 or 3 times before you start, so you know where you're going. So a lot of the homebrew stuff I did in that game was setting up some of these things much earlier in the game. Like, so like the bad guy, you know, right off the bat, like Black Spider is this guy named Neznar. He's a drow. And I was like, no, screw that. They're going to know of the Black Spider, and they're going to befriend a drow elf in town who's like their only ally in this town. And he's a guy named Neznar. But there's always this bad guy out here. So I wanted it to be a reveal, like, oh, our best friend is the bad guy after all. So like the doppelganger, I was like, gotta find a way to set this up. And essentially, like, the short version of this is through a bunch of other stuff. The doppelgangers work with Neznar, the Black Spider, and he had a whole bunch of them go out into the world, find these heroes, my player characters, because they were like so bad at what they did in real life that he could kill them and replace them with doppelgangers and convince them through magic that the doppelgangers were those. So then he could manipulate those people in his world and set up all his machinations. So the big reveal at the end of that campaign is that they weren't the people they thought they were. They were doppelgangers who had been convinced they were their characters. And now it was their choice, knowing that this is your master and this is it. What do you choose to do? Do you choose to still be the person you want to be, or do you give in to whatever you were, you know, born to be? And to me, it was like, this is such a great story moment. It's such a good reveal. It stitched together random pieces of story from the last 5 months into one moment. And when that moment happened, it fell like a turd in the middle of church. Like, it just, it did not land at all. And I realized afterwards in reflecting, my problem is I did not honor the sacred relationship between a player and their character. So by telling them all that their characters were not who they thought they were, and they were actually doppelgangers put there by the bad guy, I severed the emotional connection they had to their character. Because they were like, oh, everything I knew was a lie. I'm not who I thought I was. And even though we went to a place where they were allowed to like permanently become the characters or change into something else, or they were allowed to make that choice of, I'm going to overcome my nature and I'm still going to defeat the bad guy because that's who I really am. All those moments were disconnected because they were suddenly ripped apart from their character. They were told everything that they felt and knew about this person that they'd lived in for months was not real. And I realized, like, you always have to honor how much your players are connected to their characters. So that is times when I've been a little more hesitant to just kill them, because I'm like, this is someone, like, they live and breathe in love. Like, they live in their heads. They create these stories and these backstories. And it's a very personal thing for most players who really get into it. And that was my biggest worst moment of D&D was just, I came up with a really cool idea that was not grounded in their connection to their characters. And that was one of the first big lessons I started to realize, like, oh, I'm telling a story with them. I'm not telling a story to them. And when I tell it to them and when I violate that connection, it causes the game to just not work.
Right. What about you, Chris?
That's a cool story element, though. Like,
it is.
Quite dig the idea of it. It seems like it would be fun to do a game like that where you're hinting. It sort of seems like that needs to be the end of the campaign, though, right? Like, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I don't know. It's a downer. Yeah, for sure. At that point, you're the Swamp Thing, right? Like, you're the plant that thinks it's a man. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Worst thing that ever happened. I don't know. I'm with Phil on ever having screwed around with the characters or their pets. I've done all of those things. I killed someone's smart donkey once, and that
was it just a donkey with glasses?
It was smart. He wanted it to have like an intelligence roll, and he was like, "It's not a human intelligence roll. It's like he's really smart for a donkey." And it's like, sure,
you're like, you can have still a 1.
Yeah, you can roll. Yeah, you can roll a die. That's fine. You know what I mean? But he would sit there all the different times that sort of stuff happened, and it would just derail it. Friendships ended over things where, like you said, characters, if you're ever a GM and you're going to try to teach your player a lesson about something, which is, like you said, you look at them, they've picked a fight with someone that they shouldn't, or it's they're never going to learn the lesson from a beatdown.
Yep.
You know what I mean? They never end up learning and the players never learn any lessons. You know what I mean? Like that's the Murphy's Law of D&D, right? But yeah, that was like I don't have a particular. I'm such a bad GM. I could talk about all of them, but one of the things that I was actually going to ask about is: has anybody tried using GPT with their games yet? Chat GPT. So I think large language models are going to be like game changing for the life of role playing games, and it might actually help me out with my GMing. I actually. Because you can give it a prompt and say, I need an NPC for a role-playing game, and they are a bartender. I want to know something about their history, and it will spit out like a really good like paragraph of stuff, and it will give you the stats. You know, you can say D&D 3rd edition, and it knows what you mean, and it will give you the character. I was gonna run a Cyberpunk 2077 game for my family, and I asked it for a plot. I said, I want a plot that has a twist and involves the characters in this way, and I don't know that I could have come up with that good of a story idea in a couple of months. You know what I mean? As an idea. So like as an idea generation thing, and then like you said, when you're sitting there with the stuck for an NPC, and it will keep a track of stuff. Like you could have all of your NPCs in their own chat, and then be like, well, they've gone through like you're saying, the guy that runs the brothel, he's like, he's had a change of heart. He's religious now. What has he done with his brothel to change this over? You know what I mean? And it will just spit out some ideas, which is something you could come up with. And I feel like Phil's probably a way better storyteller than I am on the spot for that sort of stuff. And altogether, I don't need the on the spot stuff, but the idea that I could have that in there and then have like an extension of my memory keeping track of some of those things, I feel like would be super helpful. That didn't answer your question at all, though.
Don't worry, the AI will crop that out for our YouTube shorts.
Yeah,
right.
Delete everything else. Just but your ringing endorsement, though.
Yes,
they're like, oh yes, an ally.
Yeah, the AI are our friends.
So my story kind of rolls into the next question, because I asked about the worst, and then obviously the best is the next one. So mine is kind of the worst and the best at the same time. Okay. We were playing our final session of this 4-year-long game that we had been playing, and we got into the castle, and he had. The DM had stayed up and planned out this entire castle full of necromancers from every single, like he had Death Eaters and the necromancer from Skyrim, and he had all of them in there. And so we walk in, there's a door to the right. And of course we try the door, and he said, no, you can't unlock it. You can see that it's magical and all that. And I looked to our druid, and we had just got done with an adventure where we were around dinosaurs. So I said, hey, didn't you see a triceratops? And she's like, well, yes, I did. I was like, what if you as a triceratops hit the door? And she's like, all right. And he gave her disadvantage, and she rolled 2 natural 20s in a row. And so he's very much like, it's a natural 20. I can't. So he's like, the door didn't break, but the blocks around the door shattered, and we shortcut his entire, that he had spent weeks planning. And we walked in and took a right when he really wanted us to take a left. So I loved that happened because it was just one of those things, 2 natural 20s in a row. Everyone's kind of around the table. But then after, like, everyone's cheering, and I saw his face, and I could just see disappointment, and I felt so bad. So so from a player perspective, I was like, that was awesome. But from his planning perspective, I was like, oh, I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry. We should have just gone left. I shouldn't have said anything. So it's kind of a best and worst. So what is one of your most fond or your favorite moments from either playing or DMing?
I mean, one that comes to mind mainly because of the player character responses. And again, I have to apologize for like the long-winded setup and executions. I'm trying to like skim, it's sometimes 6 months to a year's worth of story into a second to get the impact. But I had the main campaign we're doing right now. The first half was a lot about threats of the undead. A lot of the characters had backgrounds where undead overran the city and killed everyone around them, and they had to escape, or there was things in the city they were in that was like undead threats. And at one point, there was a whole horde of undead who came out of the woods during a carnival, and they had to team up with all the NPCs and just this massive fight beat down to finally find a way to vanquish them all. We fast forward a couple months. They have left the city. They are elsewhere. There's a big fight happening, and a character jumps in front of a beholder to save another character and gets killed. And they go on this quest to find his soul and restore it to his body, and it puts them into like a sliver of the like astral plane somewhere, like this broken section. There's Gith and Githyank, like all these people that they're fighting and trying to find this guy's soul to restore it. And they're in this plane where there's undead everywhere. And in process of kind of getting the soul and getting out of there, they open up a bunch of different portals on accident, fighting the bad guy that they're fighting to get out of there. And essentially the undead spill into all these portals, and these portals open up to places in time throughout the backstory of this campaign. So it opens up to the city where one of the characters, when they were a child, undead overran the city and killed their family and everyone they knew. It opens up to the city that they were in, where like there's the horde of undead on the carnival where they lost a bunch of their NPC friends. So essentially, I just set it up to where through actions of trying to save their friend, they created all the undead problems that had plagued them their entire life. And then they get out of the plane and they get back and they resurrect their friend, and he comes back in a different form because resurrection is a different spell than restoring life and stuff. But there was so much of that I put together literally 15 minutes before we started playing. This would be cool, because this was not necessarily a planned thing. Again, I was reacting to what choices characters made, where I wasn't planning on that guy dying and I wasn't planning on this, that, or the other thing. And but you just play the story like everything is how it's supposed to be. And I had players who just lost their mind, being like, oh my God, we were the problem that started all of our lives, and everything bad that's ever happened is because of the choices that we made. We're our own self-fulfilling prophecy. How many years have you been planning it? That was the coolest thing ever. And I didn't be like, I put together most of that stuff like 10 minutes before the game. I just kind of smiled and laughed, because like we talked about earlier, you leave all these opportunities open to find ways to connect plot to character. And those are impactful moments for. And again, it was things that were open that I just put together really quick before the game. And it turned into a very like meaningful moment, especially for one of my players was texting me for like weeks about how amazing that was. And it really hit home for him. And so that's one of the moments that sticks out in my head about like, that was really successful because of what it meant to them.
It's awesome. Chris, what about you? Any moment that sticks out for you?
That sounds like a really cool game, Phil, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
And I love that idea. I used to, my favorite setting is called Deadlands. And it's like it's a zombie cowboy game for listeners. And so also any video game that even kind of smells like that, I will buy a copy of, because they promised a video game on that one for years and it never showed up. But I did run a game for where it was a Call of Cthulhu crossover. So it's like an Old West horror game, but the player characters showed up into this town. They were going to somewhere else, and they show up in this like one horse town. And then every time they try to leave one road, that road just leads back into the town from the other side of it. And so you kept walking past, and it was like, I just made it one of those things where it was like, yeah, you get provisions and stuff. There's a guy at the general store. He's like, got fresh apples today, and stuff. And they're just like, whatever. And then they're like, yeah, there's another town down at the end of the road, like you keep going and stuff like that. And then I played it like they had never been there before. They were asking me questions like how did we just talked to this guy, and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like bringing it a little bit into the real world. And once they started investigating, finding out that the characters were, that the place was rotting from the back, and it was like skinwalkers and brains in jars and stuff like that. And half of the characters went nuts by the end of it, and then reset it all at the end. You know what I mean? Because it was like, we're just having fun for the night. But that's a lot of the stuff that I would end up doing is if I could just play for one night, the game's not bad. But yeah, I quite liked how that one worked out.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I did hear a really fun idea. I think it popped up on TikTok or Instagram or one of the two, but it was the DM went to his players and said, "Hey, we're going to be going through this area, and your characters might not make it. So go ahead and make a secondary character just to keep in the back for later." And they were like, "Oh, okay." And he's like, "Send them to me." And then about halfway through that adventure, they wound up in a gladiatorial arena where they had to fight the secondary character that they made. He was leveling him up with them. And I was like, that is a fantastic idea. I cool. really like that idea.
There was that reminds me, there was someone that ran a game once where they said, we want to play this high power D&D game. I'm going to give you all these extra points, make the min-max your characters, cheat, you know what I mean? If you can, make your guys and stuff. And then they were, once we were done, he was like, all right, give me all these guys. And then he took all the characters and then he gave us like a band of goblins. He's like, you guys distribute the goblins between yourselves. These characters are guarding a caravan, and you have to steal what's on the caravan. It's like, oh my God, I know what I just built. There's no way we're doing this. Fun night, fun for one game, right? For one night,
right? No, little one shot.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last question I have tonight is if you could give a piece of advice to someone who is a new dungeon master or is looking at it or getting into it, what piece of advice would you give them?
Chris, why don't you go first? Because I might have a couple things, like kind of like an order to lay out a checklist for a new DM or something like that.
Sure. The first thing, the thing that I would do is there's a book called The Ultimate RPG Gameplay Guide. It's on Amazon. It's not sponsored, you know what I mean? But hey, we'd take the money, right? Like it wouldn't be a problem. But they have an idea in there of creating a charter with your players before you start. So having like a discussion about like what you're trying to accomplish in the game beforehand. What sort of gameplay style? What do the players expect? What are the you know what I mean? It's like about being on time. It's about being on. It's working in a team. It's the same things you should do when you're working on a team in school or in professional. This is another way to do that. To have respect for each other. Have respect for the GM's time for putting things together. Having respect for the players' time in what they're putting together. So it's those sort of things. It's those discussions that when there's hard feelings later in the game, they're easier to discuss because you talked about them beforehand, and that I feel like there's a lot of instances where games that I was involved in went south that could have been saved with some pre-planning like that. And that book actually has like some worksheets that you can go through. It's actually a really cool book on playing RPGs.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, there's a book that I have called The Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide that has a similar, it's a really great way to break down how to do it. And I think a lot of people discuss, and that falls into the same category, but I don't know if anyone realizes that it's like a session 0 where you gather all your players together and you not only just figure out like what kind of game do we want to play, what does people love, and you start building your characters, but then you also talk about etiquette and rules. And kind of to that point, and I'll get to my advice here in a second, but to that point, I've found it's really, really helpful to give everyone at the table an assignment. Because it keeps everyone engaged. Because it's hard. The bigger the party you play with, the more opportunities you have for people to disengage and play on their phone or to just kind of get lost in La La Land. And I understand it. So like I will usually have one player who tracks all the hit points for my monsters. And so even though I like to keep that information to myself, I find like this one player, I'm like, well, I'll send you all the HP numbers and you track their damage and you let me know when they're dead or when they're bloodied or things like that. that one's this one. You run this NPC. I need you to track this. Can you track this? So if everyone has like a role, especially in combat, it keeps everyone so much more engaged than like, I'm just going to save it for 20 minutes until it's my turn. I'm going to swing my sword twice and go back into zone.
Right.
And that can be like roles defined in that session 0, essentially, where you're discussing not only what kind of game do we want to play, but how do we interact and what's the table etiquette and how do we treat each other? Because that's super important. Because unfortunately, D&D games get killed by players who are on a different, let's just say a different page than the rest of the people.
Right.
Yeah, so I think I might have a couple pieces, almost like here's a couple things to kind of start with if you're going to start DMing, or if you've started DMing and you're like, I want to do a little bit better. And this is from observation from, like professional DMs like, Matt Mercer or Brennan Mulligan or other people like that. And then just kind of experience that I've had, stuff I've done well, stuff I've done wrong. When you're starting off a game, obviously that session 0 is super important. To figure out like what type of game, because you have one player is like, I want to just play like classic fantasy where I'm running around, I'm an elf and I'm shooting everyone with a bow and I want lots of combat and I want lots of high stakes, big treasure. And like, that's cool. That's a great game. If you have other players who are like, I want to run like a role play heavy on the deception, political intrigue game, a very cool game, 2 entirely different games to run. And having both of those players in the same game, it's going to be hard to find the right balance. It's not impossible, but if someone's like, I only want to fight, I don't know how to role play, I don't feel comfortable, it's going to be really hard for them to put them in a role play heavy game. So figuring out kind of like who wants to play what, I found really helpful when you're working with players at the beginning of a game to kind of give them a couple things when they build their characters. Work with them to come up with secrets their characters have, goals their characters have, desires, and something that they're hiding. And I usually will be like, what is a secret that you might share if pushed? And what is a secret you will take to your grave? You will never tell another soul at this table. And that just gets them thinking like, what is something my character's done or seen that I would never want them to know? And that really helps them start to shape and define who their character is. There is an RPG game system called Dread. It's like a horror game. It is one of the funnest RPGs I've ever played, and it's a one shot. It's a horror game. You don't win the game. Well, you can win the game, but like it's really easy to die in that game. And the idea, like essentially, to build a character instead of a character sheet, you give them a questionnaire because it's a very like role play based game. And on those questionnaires, I always ask those questions because even if they don't ever reveal that in the game, it never comes up. That it informs all their choices. I'll usually, when I start off with new characters, pair at least 2 of them together. And be like, Aaron and Christy, your characters are coming into this story having already met previously. How did you meet? And tell me about that story. So immediately players are working with each other to build a backstory together. It gives them a connection right away that they can then bring other people into. And again, that's work that they're doing that you can then just take all that information and find ways to weave that into the story. Like, 6 months ago, you guys met at a tavern in Waterdeep, and now we're here in Neverwinter. So I'll be like, okay, maybe there was someone they met in that tavern who has been tracking them the whole time. And this person will come in later. And so you're already starting to build story hooks in. When you start a game, it's that whole like, you meet in a tavern type thing. Wherever you start your thing out, I typically early on will give them like a very clearly defined goal and quest. And I work with players to be like, and I've had GMs do this with me as well, be like, guys, this is a role-playing game. I realize it's fun to do everything but what you're supposed to do, but I need you to be cooperative to buy into the fact that this is a game and that there's a quest and you need to like actively do something. So at least we start doing something. So I will try and make sure across the board, but especially early on, there's a very clearly defined goal. Like a goblin runs in and says, a princess has been captured and here is a reward to find her. And I want, my players to understand like, there's a hook. I should probably take that hook. Because the clearer goals are, the easier it is for them to decide what they want to do. Nothing's worse as a player, because I've been this player before, where you're like, I don't know what to do. Like, I can do anything, but because I can do anything, I don't know what to do. But if I have two or 3 options, then I'm like, now I can make choices, and choices is what D&D is all about. Then I try and give limits and constraints to things like, this princess is in a castle, but she is going to die in 10 days. So that puts time on the clock. So if they can get there in 10 days, they can stop. If they don't get there in 10 days, she dies, and then now her death has consequences for them or the kingdom or something. The clearer you can be, especially early on, as they're figuring out who their characters are and how they react, it gives you as a DM an easier chance, because nothing's harder than starting with a sandbox. And the sandbox is a term in Dungeons and Dragons or in role-playing games where you're like, you can go anywhere and do anything. And as a DM, especially at the beginning of a game, a sandbox is impossible to plan for, because you don't know who these characters are. You don't know what choices they're going to make. And if they make a million different choices, you have to come up with a million different scenarios. So by giving them limits and constraints, it makes it easier for you to plan really cool stuff as they figure out who their characters are and you observe what kind of choices they make. And then from there, you can start to open up the world. And from there, from those choices and the things you learn about them, now you can build plot around them. And you can find ways to connect that first plot back to their characters. And then they care because their choices have impact on the world and the world is impacting their choices. And I mean, those are like some of my like recommendations or tips. I know that was quite a bit, but again, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons as a DM, and it was hard to be like, there's so many more resources now post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. People were playing D&D. It was popular, but I feel like because of pandemic, so many great channels popped up about how to do this. Like, things like Dungeon Dudes is a channel that I really, really love, where these guys do like 45-minute video essays on everything in the world. And then, you know, you can go back and watch Vox Machina on Amazon Prime now, or you can start campaign 2 or 3 of Critical Role. And at the time it was like, I am so both overwhelmed and underwhelmed. There's so much content, but none of it was geared to be helpful. Now it's like, there's so much stuff and it's so much easier. But still, those are some. And then I think we were talking about this maybe before we started recording, but as a DM, you also want to be very careful and watch what items and gold and loot you give your characters.
Yes.
Because it's so easy to be like, you got the coolest sword ever, good job. And then later they're a level 3 person swinging a sword that they shouldn't get till level 16. And you're like, I can't throw bad guys at you strong enough to stop you from instantly killing them without overwhelming and killing everyone. It's so imbalanced when you just get excited. I've done this so many times. I get excited, give them something cool, and I have to deal with the consequences of like they've broken the game constantly.
The D&D is about choices and consequences.
It is
at every level.
The consequences of the choices you made. Awesome. I don't know. That's a lot. I'm sorry. I'm getting going.
No, that is great. That is some great stuff. I mean, we could probably talk for another 2 hours about D&D. I feel like we barely scratched the surface of it, but
I can come back. We can come back. We'll do this in a couple months again and do a part 2.
Perfect.
Periodic segment.
Yes, absolutely. I am down. I guess thanks for coming on, Philip. Let everyone know where they can find your stuff and what you got going on.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm occasionally still on Twitter at Phillip Sevy. I'm on Instagram at Phillip Sevy Comic Art. As far as stuff going out, I've been drawing the better part of an X-Men Unlimited run, which is it's an Infinity vertical scroll comic exclusive to the Marvel Unlimited app. I just personally wrapped up about 7 months of working on that title. The last couple issues will be out. It's written by Steve Fox and Steve Orlando with art by me and Nick Roche, colors by Yen Nitro. It's real fun. It ties into the fall of Krakoa. It is a 25-part series, which no one has ever attempted anything to the scope that we've done on Marvel Unlimited. I also have a story in the upcoming X-Men Wedding Special, which is the Pride issue that Marvel is releasing this year. I illustrated a story that Teenie Howard wrote about Captain Britain and Ascani making their way to the wedding of Destiny and Mystique. And I read the whole issue last week. Our editor sent it out, and it's fantastic. It's brilliant. I cried the whole way through. Awesome. It is so very good. That'll be out May 29th. And then Teenie and I, along with an incredible crew of creators, will be signing at Black Cat Comics for their anniversary signing in June. So if you're local or coming in for the signing, pick up the Pride issue, and we would love to sign it for you.
That's awesome. Yeah, you shared a picture of a Gambit that you drew a couple months back, and that I was like, this is my favorite version of Gambit that I've ever seen. I was this just needs to be Gambit everywhere all the time. I love it.
Thanks. I just actually drew a Gambit this afternoon for fun because I wasn't satisfied with that Gambit, so I'm going to post this one tomorrow.
Oh, awesome. I will keep a lookout. Chris, you guys have some stuff coming up this weekend, don't you?
Yeah, so Andrew and I are going to be at Black Hat Comics as well. So for Free Comic Book Day, it is Nerd Christmas here in the United States, everywhere. So if you got an LCS, give them a call and find out if they are participating. It doesn't mean that all of the comics are free. We get those phone calls all day long, all day. And no, they're not all free. There's a selection of them that are free, and so come down. But yeah, we'll be drawing goofy art and hanging out. And certainly make time in your day to get down for that anniversary event that's going on at Black Hats with Phil and Christy. They're also going to have, I think Doug Wagner's going to be there for that as well, and I think Matt Armstrong just signed in to be on that one as well. So, and there's going to be a few more. It's the night of too many stars for sure. So you really want to make it out there because it's a great opportunity to meet a ton of cool people. And Phil, one of my favorites. You know, I always love hanging out with you, and have one of my favorite Gull commissions sitting right on my wall here that I always get a chance to look at, where he's eating a hot dog with a fork. It's the most polite of him eating a hot dog I've seen in any medium there.
That's awesome. And I know both locations of the Nerd Store. Friend of the show, Travis Romney, will be, I believe, at the Orem location. Yep. Doug Wagner is going to be at the West Valley location. Evan Black, and then Dr. Volts as well. So if you're in you've got a plethora of amazing places to go, especially if you're in the northern Utah area. So if you are, go check those places out. But yeah, so that's all I had. Oh, Ryan's not here, so I get to do both parts of the ending. Go ahead and let us know if you have any comments or questions, topics you want us to cover. Shoot us a message and we'll go over it. And don't forget to subscribe, and you may now exit the dome.
Fuck responsibility.
And I could see the whole time. Quick, DM, come up with a witty one-liner for a sign-off.
Got nothing.
That's a good one.
I've got nothing.
I got nothing. All right.
No,
All
the sign up is like, you can sure try.
Excellent. All right, guys. We'll see you next week.